Good morning and welcome to Supermania. I am your host, Catherine McCord. As always, I do have with me my lovely co-host, Jeremy. He back there in the background, my mascot for both of my companies. I am very excited to have our guest with us today, Trip Odell. I'm going to bring him on in just a second to talk about himself. He's going to come on and tell us a bunch of wonderful information. We're going to discuss today different types of neurodiversity, different types of tools, and some of the different kind of myths surrounding some of the neurodiversity and the actual facts behind what's really going on. But before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that it's okay to ask for help. I've seen a lot of folks lately online struggling, really talking about the battles that they're having, that they're not feeling necessarily mentally healthy right now. Please reach out for help. And if at any point you feel like you're hitting the breaking point, please stop and take a break. And please do whatever you need to do to be safe and to be healthy. So with that said, I'm very excited to bring on our guest today, Trip Odell. Welcome.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited that you're here with us today. So you and I met just kind of randomly on LinkedIn. Just kind of a complete random happenstance. So can you I know a little bit about you now, but can you tell our audience a little bit about you and your background?
It's kind of a long story, but my background, I usually start my story, which seems extravagant, in elementary school because dyslexia has featured such a prominent role in my life. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia in 1979 when I was in first grade because there was such a gap between the way and I was in Pennsylvania at the time. I'm in Pennsylvania now, which is the first time in 40 years. But there was like a 5 standard deviation difference between my, say, verbal IQ and my performative IQ. It was the difference between like a 142 and like an 85 or an 88, which is quite a span.
That's huge. Yeah, that's massive.
Right. So, the force is strong in my family. And I was, at the time, I was identified with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. And as an adult, I have ADHD. So I have 3 children, all 3 of which have symptoms of dyslexia and ADHD. And the youngest has ASD. He was diagnosed with autism. And so coming to understand that, we've been on quite a journey, both through schools and through my own professional life, because most of my profession, I was in education first because I hated school so much. I studied special education for most of my undergraduate.
That's wonderful. I like that. I like that problem solving. Like, I had a bad experience, so I'm going to go fix this over here and have a much better experience for everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of what I did was using technology. I was that first generation. Like, first time I used a word processor, I was accused of plagiarism in high school. I had to drop special education as my major because my handwritten field notes, they wouldn't let me type them. They had to be the dysgraphia. So that's illegal now, right? But it wasn't in 1994. So I switched to political science. I worked on Capitol Hill for a while. I actually did speech writing and press releases for a trade association.
Imagine that. Hold on, I want to pause on that. So imagine that. Just for where you went and people, that this is why I always focus on the show about how other people put the limitations on you. Look at, I mean, you were a successful speechwriter, and all this time they were going, oh, you can't.
Well, we had spell check and grammar check by then, right? So, and I'm actually a pretty strong writer. It's just labor intensive, and I do it very differently.
Right.
But the other, and so I actually disliked that career. Went and dug ditches and waited tables for a year and became a volunteer teacher on the Pine Ridge Reservation.
Wait, whoa! You went from writing to ditch digging and waiting tables.
Yeah, because that's the catch 22 in education is that you can't get a job without the experience, but you can't get the experience without the job.
That's so true in so many fields, and it's
Right.
so backward.
And my
It's
my my
just like
career is so we'll get there, right? So I joined the Jesuit Volunteers and was a volunteer teacher because I did it because I wanted to teach, and so they would give me a shot as a volunteer, having a full teaching load, doing 2 years, and I was in the poorest place in the United States, and I was teaching photography and multimedia and basically various aspects of storytelling with media. And I taught for a number of years, and this was really empowering people with technology to tell their own stories because these are people. It was the Lakota Nation that aren't represented in media in very positive ways, especially in the 90s.
that's true.
So they would dress like Latino gang members, and that was people that looked like them in media. So they had some sort of
That's so sad. Hold on, wait. I gotta sit with
yeah,
that for a minute. That is so sad.
right.
So sad. Jesus.
Right. So, I mean, we saw some grim stuff and it toughened me up. But then I kind of got this bug with the technology like I was pretty good at this. So I taught for a few more years. I went back to graduate school and did very well in graduate school. I studied cognitive science. It was actually media effects. So basically how the brain interacts with media and processes various types of media, which as a dyslexic, you might find like
I
that's kind
think
of an
that is
interesting.
so cool. I would
Yeah.
be interested in that.
Yeah.
I love to learn more about how people think and the way the brain works. But I
Yeah.
want to pause real quick. 'Cause you made me think about something. So I've talked in the show before about the negative effects of media on the neurodiverse community.
Mhm.
And my personal outlook on it, and I want to qualify this by saying I perfectly understand why other people do not share this, is for me, I'm going, you know, Hollywood exaggerates everything. They make everything ridiculous. So I just kind of blow it off, but it has factually done some damage and caused some unhealthy biases. So what are your thoughts on that since you kind of worked in that space?
Yeah. Well, I mean, specifically to neurodiversity, I think that I often like look at the historic connection between the way that we're often treated or characterized in popular media with people in the LGBT community. I mean, I'm Gen X. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and
Right.
things were a lot less um, compassionate in how we talked about people in media and the way that we talk to one another. And I experienced some of that as a kid that was in self-contained because
Wow.
this was pre-inclusion. So they put us all the different kids in one class and sort of taught to the lowest common denominator. And then, but before we get into the pity porn there, which is often the problem with people that are
Yeah.
different. Um, the After graduate school, I went on, and it was one of those overnight successes. In that took 20 years. Is like eventually ended up in big tech. So I was a design lead at Adobe, working on their consumer products and their first cloud services. I was at Microsoft, working on Hotmail and all the services that tie Windows together in both Windows 7 and Windows 8, and with 500 million daily users. And Then Audible, where I was actually able to, some of my first patents were there, looking at inclusive approaches to technology for like people like me that prefer to listen to audiobooks. I read just fine, right? People that
Right.
have visual challenges, to bring the audiobook and the Kindle edition much closer together. So a lot of my innovation work was started there. I then moved internally to Amazon. I was on Alexa, and I was responsible for about 50% of the domains that Alexa does for its first year of release. I invented a couple of new products and some additional patents there, and then went to logistics and everything that you've heard about Amazon logistics. My team was the shiny tip of the spear. We ran last mile driver experience, which is like
That's cool.
trying to get bullets to hit head on millions of times a day. And that's about $11.5 billion scope when
Right.
I left. So we went from 0 to 11.5 billion in 18 months. And I worked at an education startup and a bunch of other things. And now I'm at
So
Pearson Education.
so I love that. So you cycle back to the education fact after all this factor
Right.
after all this time. But I love that you had such uh, a robust journey
Yeah.
that's because I kind of did too. My work cycle is a very interesting long
Yeah.
saga. It's like a Lord of the Rings, but in HR form.
I,
Um,
I call
and
myself the Forrest Gump of design because it's
see,
just
there
like
you
bouncing
go.
around, right? So
And you have a compliment from one of my viewers here. She says that you're incredible. So thank you, Vanessa.
I I churn it up to, they talk about resilience. The dark side of resilience is spite. So like a lot
It's
of
the
my career
dark side.
has been about spiting the education system.
I did a whole episode with Jerry Johnson on that and talking about the education system and the problems there. And it really is kind of crazy to me because look, I just want to point out so all of these wonderful accomplishments and these really cool projects that you were part of. And when you were a child, they kind of dismissed you like, okay, we're just going to put you over here in this class. We're going to treat you less than, and we're just going to kind of poo foo you. And that just kills me because kids, first of all, are extraordinary. They can do the coolest things. They just have all the potential and they're learning at little astronomical rates. And it's really fascinating. And so to take a child and say you're less than and to squash them down for no reason, because if you can do all of that, there was never anything wrong. You just needed something different. Right. So, I mean, so now that you're back in education and since you've been through all this with education, what are your first of all, what's your message to people that are going through it right now for whatever, if they're in education and or they're watching their child go through it, which can be even
Well,
harder. And
yeah.
then second to that would be, what's your thought on how to fix it?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a half measures guy. I've never, it's sort of go big or go home. So, and we're struggling with that as well. We're in legal proceedings with our district for our youngest son, and we've been like,
Wow.
I'm like a wood chipper in an IEP meeting because I know the law.
Right.
And I think like if you're going through that process, I would say at a minimum, read this procedural guidelines for the district. Um, they're a little dense. It's very legalistic. I would say get a knowledgeable advocate or a lawyer if you can afford one. Be prepared to don't take the district's diagnosis because they'll kind of talk out of both sides. It's like, well, we need to do extensive testing to qualify you for services, but we can't diagnose. So get a diagnosis because that'll actually the diagnosis because that will trump the district's thing. So
Right.
there's a lot there. It's really weighted against anybody for most people. Like, I'm fortunate in that I work in tech and that we have some means available to us and it's not cheap
Right.
to get all that private stuff. So I think there's a lot of legal work that needs to be done. I think we need to completely re-examine the way that we educate because we're working on a 150-year-old Prussian system. Prussia doesn't even exist anymore. It was designed for factories, hasn't changed categorically. In the same way that we use medical diagnoses to describe stable cognitive traits, that is really the emerging science from, like, there's a theory out of Cambridge called complementary cognition, that these are evolved cognitive traits with distinct benefits. And
Right.
the science increasingly supports that.
Right, exactly. That's what's been so cool for me over the last few years is something that I already knew, right?
Mhm.
That I already knew. I was like, these people are amazing. I don't know what's wrong with everybody else. And, or I should say my people, because I'm in the neurodiverse community too. But to see the science catch up and to see all of a sudden, just from every different angle, all these different studies coming in to support that this is not a deficit, it's just different. This person just processes information differently, is all that it is. And so and the way I kind of explain it to people is that or it's not inherently a disability. There can
Mhm.
be actual disability within the neurodiverse community, but it is not inherently a disability, just as a different learning style is not a disability. So if you're getting up there and you're talking to a class and somebody isn't learning because they learn visually or kinetically, it's not that they're dumb.
Right.
It's that you're not communicating with them in a way that's effective to them.
Right. Yeah.
And that's it.
It's sort of like criticizing a motorcycle for only having two wheels instead of four.
Right.
You know, or you know, but it'll zip through traffic.
Or
So
going to the horse and going, oh, I can't milk you. What's wrong with you, you defective horse?
exactly. Um, and in many places, so there's somebody I follow on Twitter whose handle is Say Dyslexia, and she's a strong advocate for parents and people going through the education system, because a lot of states won't even permit their districts to say dyslexia, because then that would actually establish a fixed condition that they need to continue to service and accommodate.
Yeah, how dare
Where
they? How dare they want to do well by their students?
Well, it's a triage system, right? And this is the opportunity where technology, that's the big change that I can see, is that technology can mitigate. Like I went into technology because, not because I wanted to be a designer or that I was that into technology. It's that I saw the potential to scale human potential. I saw like what technology can do to augment and scale our abilities and mitigate weakness. So one of the
I
major, yeah.
I That's the best way. I've been trying to explain how in the world I got into technology. That's the best explanation. I'm going to steal that. I want you to know I'm
Me
very
too.
sorry, but I'm going to steal that from you.
I wish more people in technology felt that way, because we tend to put technology first. And I
It's
think
true.
um, there's a symbiotic aspect to that. And we fail to accommodate, or we fail to recognize things like reading. Reading is a technology. Reading is a system. It is a code that uh, dyslexia. It's actually about phonemic awareness. It's the language processing center of the brain, part of the brain, and it's the decoding there, and the difference between the visual cortex and and what's called Broca's area
Right.
that processes it. So that's a gap for the technology, because when you look at representative languages like cuneiforms in Chinese and whatever, they don't have the incidence of dyslexia diagnoses that we do in the West.
Now that's interesting.
Use a different part of the brain. It's one of the reasons that they
Wow.
use American Sign Language as an accommodation in school, because it
Right.
uses the visual cortex to actually create meaning. It's not translation from the sound. So I
That's
think
cool.
so. And that's the hard part. It's very easy to talk about this stuff in school. And one of the things about the pandemic is I'm a huge fan. Like, I actually had a podcast for a year called Brave New Workforce, talking about all the positive changes going to come out of the pandemic.
And there are
Um,
many. There are a whole lot. Yeah.
but I think that you see more and more people coming out around their neurodiversity or their struggles or their suspicions around their difference. Um, because work from home kind of broke that. And it's not that
Yes.
work from home is fundamentally broken. It's that we're trying to do it in the way I sometimes compare it to the early days of the web, where we would literally try to make a web page look like a piece of paper and
Oh,
act like a
yes.
piece of paper.
I recently saw a site that still looked that way. And I was like, what in the world? I haven't seen this since like the early 90s. What's
Right.
happening here?
Right. It's got tabs just like a folder.
Yep.
And it's just like our way of thinking of it hasn't changed. So we haven't changed our way of thinking about work. We haven't changed our way of thinking about schools and how we educate and the role
And
that
I want to point
technology
something
plays.
out real quick.
Yeah.
The education system, and I have a lot of educators in my family, a
Right.
lot.
Yep.
And and so right now, currently, the oldest one is my grandfather, who is 88 years old. He's
Hmm.
been teaching since he was in his 20s. Okay.
Right.
It's a big span of time. And he was discussing how the education system has not changed.
Hmm.
And I want to just so with all the technological advance and all that we've learned about the human mind and all that we've learned about learning styles and all of that, somehow the education system has ultimately not changed in 60 plus years.
Longer than that, I would say. Like
Probably.
if you go back to the Prussian system, which was, I think, in the early 19th century, it was designed bell schedules, classrooms of 30, standardized curricula, teaching to a minimum level of mastery to prepare people for factories. We don't work in an industrial economy
Right.
anymore. We work in an information economy. But the way we teach hasn't changed. Universities are probably the least changed of all, because I mean their roots go back to the Middle Ages. So
Right.
there's a Now, the irony is that you look at something like smartphones, and I was there when the iPhone came out in Silicon Valley, and we look at how differently we use personal computing on a device you can touch and hold in your pocket, and it has all sorts of sensors on it than we do on a personal computer.
Right.
That happened in like the course of a decade. This has not changed in decades and
Right.
decades.
Right. And so it's fascinating to me. It's insane to me that this has not changed. And the same thing is true even in terms of how we train adults. So when somebody goes into a new job, and so I work in HR for anybody who does not know that's watching, and people get trained the same way that they used to, forever ago. And that's insane to me. That's crazy. We have all these new availabilities. And I went to Web Summit, which was a cool experience. I got to go in November, and people from all over the world bringing their ideas together in ways to make the world better. And one guy brought in his education tool, and it was this kind of a game where a kid could pick a historical figure or event, hold up their iPad or tablet or whatever, and when they scanned around them, it would show them a whole world, and they could click on different people who would talk to them about what was going on. They could ask questions of the characters. And it was like a game, and it was the coolest. I took that thing and I played with it for the longest time. And I'm an adult and I was playing a child's game, just completely and totally enamored with this.
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing with augmented reality. I actually think there's far more potential for that. I remember number of years ago, I was in Amsterdam for had this app on the phone that it was geolocated, but you could point it at buildings and it would give you directions, but it would tell you what buildings were. And I don't speak Dutch,
that's cool. I like that.
Yeah, and I'd see a building, I was like, that's gorgeous. I wonder what kind of castle that was, and I point at it, and of course, everything's older in Amsterdam, so it looks gorgeous to an American, right? It was like a post office, right? It's like there's no history here.
But it's still cool.
It's so cool.
I tell you, but so how would this work I feel like for the neurodiverse community, moving to these types of tools for both adult training and children would be astronomical in terms of advancing how everything works for us.
So you think about ways. We're getting into the double empathy problem, right? So obviously I'm a storyteller. It's actually a strength for dyslexics. Our right prefrontal cortex, where the visual part of it, and episodic memory, which is the storytelling part of the brain, we're lopsided. It's much stronger on the right, weaker on the left. But we're known to be people like Steven Spielberg and God, the Goodfellas guy, Scorsese. They're dyslexic, right? That's a common thing. But I think when you look at that, my stories are often like movies in my brain that I'm trying to narrate to somebody that can't see it. And I make these intuitive leaps, these dot connections. I've had people literally tell me, I've never met anybody that can see 5 corners ahead like you can, but they want me to explain it and prove it. And it's like, I've got to fly from Seattle to Chicago and then give somebody driving directions.
Right. It's not so easy.
Yeah. So, but I think I think there's ways for the technology to help, but I think it's going to come from people that, a good product solves a problem or a pain, right? It's not like, we're pretty simple creatures, is that we seek pleasure and avoid pain. And there's an old saying within product is that a person doesn't buy a drill, they buy a 1/4-inch hole.
It's true.
Yeah.
And so they buy the end result.
Right. So I think when it's not going to come, those solutions aren't going to come out of research. They're not going to come out of research labs or typical tech companies. Are going to come out of a community that suffers those problems and actually finds a generally applicable solution that also solves for that problem. Most of my patents came out of this approach called inclusive design, where you look at the extremes in a group rather than in the center. And then those extremes will tell you more about what the needs are, that can be generalized to the center. And that's just better design, right? So that's
Right.
so I think those types of, if you have a problem like this, and they call these Silicon Valley diseases, because leaning in on the medical definition, pathology of anybody that's different, that's a uh, I think that's an opportunity. Is where would we
Right.
leverage things like machine learning and AI and computer vision and augmented reality to help people that might struggle with um, discerning
Right.
facial,
And
yeah,
I do a lot of work with people that have ASD,
yeah,
autistic spectrum disorder, for anyone who
yeah,
does not know what that means. And and I have people very near and dear to me that have ASD. And that is something that would definitely help them. And instead of creating the masking effect, so masking is when people who have a difference try to pretend that they don't, basically, and they do everything they can to behave completely unnaturally to them, to seem to blend in with everybody else. And it
hmm
actually has been proven. I just read an article in Psychology Today about this. I've seen one from Yale, from Drexel University, about how unhealthy that is for your mind, and how it actually builds up and creates long-term problems,
hmm
actually in their mind, and also with their mental health as well.
hmm
And so I think it is very important to start accepting people. And this is something I talk about a lot on the professional front, accepting people as they are, because they actually work more effectively. So Hewlett Packard has a program around the neurodiverse community, and they not only hire, but then they cultivate
right.
that neurodiverse
Yep.
talent, and they let everybody be. What do you need? What do you need? We're going to give it to you and set you up for success. And those teams produce excuse me, sorry, those teams produce at a 30% higher production
Yep.
rate than their counterparts. And yeah, part of it's that neurodiverse people are awesome, right? But then the other part is just letting people be themselves.
Yep. And Bill Hewitt, the co-founder of Hewlett Packard, famously dyslexic. There's
Yes,
many
he is.
organizations like GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA, has a special unit of dyslexics, uh, because we're better at mapping terrorism networks and financial fraud and these complex matrixed organizations, and sort of predicting what will happen. Those are characteristics of dyslexia. The Israeli military they recruit people who are autistic, um, to for their Iron Dome air defense system, because they can see
Right.
signal in the noise much better. So those are all things where more thoughtful organizations are looking at, how do you actually, like, what does real accommodation look like? And it's not
Right.
just, it goes beyond just inclusion. It goes to valuing, and not
Yes.
valuing for selfish reasons. Well,
Yes.
it's enlightened self-interest. It's not
And
just virtue
yes,
signaling.
it's understanding that when you lift others up, everybody succeeds. And it's also, to me, it's, and one of the things I've been teaching is, I don't like the word accommodation, because accommodation, it's it somehow it's developed this negative association, like it's going to
Mhm.
be something complicated and something difficult. So I've started telling HR folks to use the word options when they talk to executives, because it doesn't sound so downtrodden, and just that switch in language seems to create more success in getting what you need. And so that's something I also tell candidates to do, is say, hey, are there any options for this, because this is something, that I'm going to need to work. So to use just that change
Yeah.
in verbiage.
Well, it's something I saw to an to an extent, um, on the reservation, is that you have these people that are stuck in three cultures: dominant culture, traditional culture, and reservation culture, which is this dysfunctional mix of the two.
Right.
And going in this is essentially a poster child for privilege, as a teacher and volunteering, there was a lot of animosity early on, until you kind of proved otherwise, of not having a savior complex. And I think that's the
Right.
same place that accommodation comes from, is that you're not valuing me, for what I can contribute. You're accommodating me because you're legally required to if I slip through your filter. B, it
I like
makes
to slip through your filter. I like that.
Right. Or B, it's something that you give to me as opposed to something that you actually take a
Right.
high performer and optimize an environment for high performance.
Absolutely. So with that, we're kind of out of town, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. No, this has been a wonderful conversation. I absolutely enjoyed it. And I actually want us to continue it. So you and I are going to have to do a part 2.
Sure.
I'm just going to rope you into that. Because this is there's just so much here to unpack about the importance of accommodation versus options versus truly understanding. And it really is true. Accommodation has gotten this downtrodden, like, oh, I just have to deal with you. Kind of like how your school treated you when you were a kid, right? That was them accommodating in their minds. Whereas here, this is about what we're talking about is understanding the value somebody else has and steering into that value, right?
Yeah. And I think like a last thought on that is like with accommodations, a challenge the business people is like for an accommodation that costs you anywhere from nothing to maybe a few $1,000s, you're defraying the costs of tens of thousands of dollars of attrition costs of
right.
And law and opportunity costs to potentially millions or even tens of millions for people like myself that can bring intellectual property and disruptive products to your business. So
right.
it's again the enlightened self-interest. So look beyond sort of your petty cash, funds to get a simple technology hack
right.
In place and look at the bigger opportunity.
100%. I love that. That's a great note to close on. I want to thank you so very much for joining us today, Trip. It's been a trip. You know what? It's been an absolute trip having you. Thank you again for joining. We did have a question about Jeremy. Jeremy has a whole backstory about how I won him. Feel free to reach out to me, Leanne, if you have further questions about that. But thank you so much. Trip, this has been a wonderful conversation. We'll definitely have a part 2. And as we exit, please tell folks how to find you.
So on LinkedIn, I mean, the nice thing about having a weird name is that it's easy to find me. And I've got my portfolio and sort of website, and I write on Quora, including about dyslexia and those sorts of things. But yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way to get a hold of me. I don't tweet because it's hard for that.
I'm not a tweeter either.
It's hard for me to say anything in 256 characters. Right.
Fair enough. Same. I don't think I have dyslexia, but I actually have the same thing. I think I just talk too much in my case. But thank you so much for joining us. Please connect to us both on LinkedIn. Reach out to us with any questions. Trip, we're definitely going to have a part 2 because this was awesome. And with that, bye, everybody. Have a wonderful week.
Bye.